Throughout the decades of animation, there are many Japanese artists who have been called the Japanese Walt Disney. The most obvious and direct comparison would be Osamu Tezuka. After all, he was the pioneer of Japanese animation, and his iconic art style, most notably his character's large round eyes that allowed for a wide range of expression and emotion, is something the anime industry still draws upon to this day. Historically, Tezuka was the father of anime, the same way that Disney was the father of animation. Other Japanese artists have found themselves compared to Disney as well. Perhaps the most well-known in the modern day is Hayao Miyazaki, whose films are lauded for being ambitious, thematically rich, character-driven stories, with incredibly intricate and detailed animation. The comparisons to Disney are indeed apt here. Miyazaki's films are regularly considered masterpieces, tentpoles of the industry, and revolutionary examples of what the theatrical anime medium is capable of. It's even to the point now where Miyazaki's films are localized and distributed in the West by the Walt Disney Corporation itself, effectively making them official Disney movies in a certain sense. And as Miyazaki has gotten older, the man's in his 80s now, many have been eager to point a finger at the next Miyazaki, the artist who will figuratively take up his mantle as the industry's next big name, and who will hold and perhaps even raise the bar set by Tezuka and Miyazaki. There's one animator who has become the popular choice for this theoretical role, one who was deeply inspired by Miyazaki's works and even briefly worked at Miyazaki's Studio Ghibli and was set to direct one of their films, one who has been called Japan's greatest living animator, Mamoru Hosoda. And believe it or not, his first film was a Digimon film. Mamoru Hosoda was born in Toyama, Japan on September 19, 1967, and was inspired to pursue animation after seeing the 1979 Lupin III film, The Castle of Cagliostro, which was the first film directed by Hayao Miyazaki. Hosoda's artistic skills would grow throughout his early adulthood, along with his aspirations for a job at Miyazaki's animation studio, Studio Ghibli. After attending Kanazawa College of Art in the study of oil painting, Hosoda would create a 1-minute short film as his resume. The short was a simple animation about a dragon battling a fighter jet, which was hand-drawn on roughly 1,000 individual paper sheets. While his submission to Studio Ghibli did earn him praise from Miyazaki himself, that praise was unfortunately accompanied by a rejection letter. Instead, Hosoda would find a job at Toei Animation, arguably the biggest animation studio in Japan, and responsible for such seminal works as Mazinger, Dragon Ball, and Sailor Moon. Hosoda was brought into Toei Animation in 1992, starting as an in-between animator before quickly proving himself and being promoted to key animator. Over the next few years, he would work on several Toei franchises, particularly their various films, which tended to be higher budget and more cleanly animated than the shows they were based on. As a key animator, he worked on several films for the Dragon Ball and Sailor Moon franchises, among others, as well as a brief stint on a few episodes of Revolutionary Girl Utena using a pseudonym. But it wasn't until late 1998 when he was chosen for his first directing job, a short film meant to showcase Toei's newest licensed property, Digimon. Digimon, short for Digital Monsters, was a Bandai-owned virtual pet toy franchise that launched in summer 1997 and was meant to act as a boy-centered counterpart to their then massively popular Tamagotchi. While Tamagotchi was not conceived as a girl-specific toy, Bandai noticed that it was far more popular with girls than with boys. Realizing that half of their market wasn't being properly capitalized on, Bandai, collaborating with toy company Wiz, conceived a new franchise that would use the same basic concept of Tamagotchi, a virtual pet that would grow into different forms depending on the player's level of care. But instead of cute, friendly aliens that take random, silly shapes, these virtual pets would be monsters, inspired largely by classic Japanese kaiju characters, with a flair and aesthetic inspired by Western superhero comics of the era, specifically the art of Todd McFarlane, which were popular in Japan at the time. So in short, lots of rock-hard abs. While this flair gave Digimon a more edgy appeal than its sister franchise, there was one thing that was specific to Digimon when compared to Tamagotchi, and that was its battling capability. Bandai chose to focus on this competitive aspect, which they felt would better appeal to their target demographic of young boys, allowing two devices to connect and battle against one another. The original line of digital monster V-Pets was fairly popular in Japan, piggybacking off the already massively successful Tamagotchis, so it was only a matter of time before Bandai would decide to expand the property into other mediums. This most obviously resulted in merchandise like small minifigurines of the various monsters to fill gachapon machines. But Digimon would also receive a collectible trading card games being a fairly new trend at the time, and a small handful of video games, all of which were based on the V-Pet mechanics. Its first narrative endeavor was in a one-shot manga titled Come On Digimon in late 1997, which was based entirely on the version 1 V-Pet and produced even before the various monsters had been given finalized designs. Come On would soon be followed in late 1998 with a serialized manga in V-Jump magazine from the same author-artist duo, titled Digimon Adventure 01 V-Tamer. This would be the proper introduction of the character Taichi Yagami, and V-Tamer would go on to become the longest-running singular narrative in the franchise's history, running for 58 monthly chapters from November 1998 to August 2003. Given the growing success of the Digimon manga alongside the V-Pets and card game, Bandai naturally pursued the idea of an animated adaptation, choosing Toei Animation as their licensee after their success handling other Bandai properties, Dragon Ball and Sailor Moon. Concepts began at the end of 1998 for a Digimon animated short to broaden the franchise's reach, and Mamoru Hosoda was ultimately chosen to helm the project as his first official directing job. While Digimon did have a narrative storyline at the time in the form of V-Tamer, the manga was still new and its longevity not yet guaranteed, and Toei felt it better to do something new entirely. This essentially gave Hosoda and the film's screenwriter, Reiko Yoshida, carte blanche to tell whatever story they wanted, based solely on the core concept of the V-Pets. Originally conceived as a simple kaiju story a la classic Showa-era Godzilla films, Hosoda and Yoshida soon found it difficult to tell a proper kaiju tale in the span of the film's scant 20-minute target runtime. But almost immediately, Toei and Bandai saw the potential in the property and would greenlight a serialized TV anime to premiere alongside the short. The series was headed by Hiroyuki Kakudo, who somewhat ingeniously envisioned the show not as a battle-centric or tournament story, but a character-focused coming-of-age tale about a group of kids struggling to find their place in life, with the evolution of their partner Digimon paralleling their personal growth into adulthood. Seeing this, Hosoda found the solution to his problem, and was inspired to change the course of his own film. He decided to scale down on the giant monsters, and instead focus the story on two children who would discover and bond with them. While not set in the same narrative timeline as the V-Tamer manga, the short would utilize a younger version of Taichi Yagami as its central character, as well as creating a little sister character for him named Hikari. For the concurrent TV anime, Taichi would again be repurposed, this time using his V-Tamer design nearly verbatim. And while the two projects were initially separate, opening and closing lines were added to the short film to vaguely tie the two anime projects together, properly evolving the project from a simple proof-of-concept short film into essentially a pilot episode and prequel to the upcoming TV series. The film would debut just one day before the anime's first episode at the spring 1999 Toei Anime Fair, a now-defunct twice or thrice annual showcase of Toei's animated properties that began in 1969. The film itself is small-scale, mostly taking place within one apartment. The film's plot revolves around a 7-year-old Taichi and his younger sister Hikari, then a toddler, discovering an egg that mysteriously manifests from their father's PC in the middle of the night. After hatching, the resulting creature, which interestingly is never referred to as a Digimon within the film, evolves into a new form and bonds with the pair of children. But the following night, its growth becomes frightening, resulting in a feral, dinosaur-like monster stumbling through the city and causing damage. The appearance of a second, more deadly monster results in a battle, and when things look their bleakest, the children's bond with their own monster triggers one final metamorphosis, and the attacker is successfully fended off in a gorgeously animated kaiju battle, with a little help from a certain whistle. Aside from the end credits, which use a shortened edit of the TV series opening theme Butterfly, the entire short uses only one musical piece, Maurice Ravel's 1880s classic, Bolero. The song would go on to become a recurring motif in the various Digimon Adventure stories and sequels, seeing use as recently as 2020's Digimon film, Last Evolution Kizuna. It also showcases Agumon and Greymon as the primary monsters, who would go on to become two of the most recognizable faces of the franchise. We would also be remiss to not bring up Hosoda's signature style of animation. Rather than aiming for super detailed line work or heavy shading, Hosoda opts for a washed-out, almost minimalistic style to animating his characters. The primary purpose of this choice is to allow for more fluid, energetic, and natural-looking movement, with a happy side effect of better adhering to a low budget. Tiny body movements and facial expressions are deliberate yet subtle, which allows for a great range of emotion despite the lack of detail. But the film is no slouch in action scenes. The battle between Greymon and Parrotmon is still a standout scene in the franchise, and there's just something about the way Hosoda drew Agumon and Greymon that has a certain je ne sais quoi, adhering to their Bandai designs while also resembling and moving like, we presume, real dinosaurs. While this minimalistic style would evolve throughout the years as Hosoda became more accomplished, not to mention once he was granted truly sizable budgets, his art is truly his own. Even within his licensed works, you can tell you're watching a Hosoda movie without having to be told. The film, alongside the premiere of the TV anime, succeeded in what it set out to do, and truly made Digimon into a household name. The plot of this short would eventually be fully adopted, rather than merely alluded to, into the TV series canon several months down the line, truly cementing it as part of the larger narrative universe. It would only be a few months before Hosoda would find himself working on Digimon again. He would be brought on to direct episode 21 of the show's first season, titled Koromon's Great Battle in Tokyo, or in the English dub, Home Away from Home, with Reiko Yoshida once again helming the script. It should be noted that Yoshida was not a regular writer for the show. She had so far only written one episode very early in the show's run, and was likely brought back specifically because of her established track record with Hosoda on the previous short film. Episode 21 is the first in the show's third story arc, and picks up on a cliffhanger wherein Taichi and his Digimon Agumon inexplicably find themselves in Tokyo after being stranded for months in the digital world, only to find that it is somehow the same day in which he left. That day is August 1st, 1999, the very day the episode itself aired. An interesting creative decision that seems to ground the episode into reality. August 1st would become a meaningful date amongst the Digimon fandom, being considered a sort of in-universe anniversary that Bandai and Toei celebrate with announcements and live events, now officially referred to as Odaiba Memorial Day, Odaiba Day, or Digimon Day. Additionally, Hosoda himself would make references to the date in his future works, such as Summer Wars.
You lied last night. You didn't forget her birthday. It's your passcode. 0108 August 1st. You came home to see Granny. I know you did.
As the episode continues, the audience is reintroduced to Hikari, this being her first appearance or even acknowledgement since the original short film. She openly alludes to the events of the film by recognizing Koromon, raising the question of why she remembers Digimon and yet Taichi did not, laying seeds for future plot points. The episode is a unique one in the series, both aesthetically and tonally. The animation, for one, is several steps above the usually cheap-looking art of the episodes both before and after it, and we no doubt have Hosoda's hand to point to as the reason why. The soundtrack is subdued, almost entirely silent, occasionally interjected with Maurice Ravel's Bolero, just like the short film, and a simple woodwind piece at the very end. And the script and atmosphere of the episode is notably more melancholic, almost surreal. Taichi begins to wonder if the digital world was ever even real or just some bad dream. Or maybe this Tokyo is the dream. Both? Neither? It's a feeling the audience themselves may begin to share throughout the runtime. However, it's only a matter of time before Taichi starts to grow complacent, finally home again after so long. But it soon becomes apparent that the problems in the digital world are bleeding over into ours, as phantom Digimon only he and Hikari seem to be able to see cause random destruction and bizarre weather across the globe. Added to this, Taichi becomes aware that he was the only one of the group who made it out of the digital world. And so after 20 episodes of trying to get home, and despite his sister's pleas for him to stay, Taichi has to make the hard but responsible decision to return to the digital world and help his friends, and try to figure out what's causing these Digimon to cross over. On paper, the episode can seem almost inconsequential. Taichi comes home, trouble happens, he leaves. But this would prove to be a major turning point for the show. Mysteries are laid, stakes are raised, plot points are established to be followed up on later. The entire episode focuses solely on Taichi and Hikari, with basically no cuts to the other cast members, other than what appears to be a garbled distress call on a computer screen that lasts less than a minute. This episode was by far the most singular character-focused episode of a show that had already put a lot of stock into its characters and their interactions with one another. Additionally, the reintroduction of Hikari would eventually lead to her being made a core cast member, and the real-world setting of the episode was a stark and welcome contrast to the digital world, and would lead to an 11-episode story arc taking place in the real world later on, which is generally considered a fan favorite to this day. And the thing is, none of that was ever really planned. Starting from the very next episode, things were back to business as usual. The kids were all back in the wonderland that is the digital world, solving episodic problems with monsters of the week, and it would remain that way for roughly half of the next story arc. And yikes, does the return to the cheaper animation really stick out after this one.
Oh! Ew! Dude! What the fuck?
Showrunner Hiroyuki Kakedo has said that while Hosoda was brought on as a guest director for the episode, he ultimately thought Hosoda's style clashed too harshly with his own vision for the story. Kakedo had no desire to add Hikari to the main cast. He had no desire for a substantial story arc set in the real world, and he had no desire to firmly integrate the short film prequel into the canon. These were decisions made by his writing staff and the show's producers, who were all simply fond of Hosoda's contribution and wanted to see him fleshed out. Kakedo ultimately agreed to these choices only once his writers had convinced him that they could be incorporated without compromising his own vision. There's also a particular elephant in the room to discuss when it comes to Digimon Episode 21, and while it's not something I'll delve too deeply into here, because it could honestly take up its own video, I'd be remiss not to touch on it at least a little bit. Okay, so in a 2001 interview included in the Digimon movie book, yeah, that's what it's called, Hosoda discusses episode 21, describing it as having a, quote, somewhat erotic feel, and that people have told him that the episode smells. He compares Hikari and Koromon's interactions to those of a wife and her husband's mistress, so that's,
Oh! Ew! Dude! What the fuck?
Look, there's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot of debate over how serious Hosoda was even being during this interview, whether his choice of metaphor was meant to be just that, a metaphor, or whether it was the intended actual subtext all along. There's even some debate over the accuracy of the translation of this interview, and even rumors that the entire thing might be a hoax in some way. While I find it hard to take Hosoda's words at face value here, simply due to the sheer absurdity of what is being said, we quite simply don't have a lot of answers here. It's a conversation to be had for sure, but given how many times in the transcript Hosoda is said to have laughed during this particular topic, I'm personally of the mind that he was simply being, let's say, colorful, and there is not actually any intended incestuous subtext between these two characters, especially given that these characters are children. But with that incredibly weird topic aside, Episode 21 is a standout in the first season, and even in the history of Digimon as a whole. A lot of the things that are considered defining moments of the franchise likely would not have happened if not for Hosoda's creation. And even still, the best was yet to come. It was once again only a matter of months before Hosoda did more work for Digimon, being chosen to direct another short film, with Reiko Yoshida helming the screenplay once more, making this their third collaboration in this franchise alone. Given a 40-minute target runtime and set for release at the following Toei Anime Fair in March 2000, Hosoda at first struggled to find a concept that he felt would work. Despite this film being twice the length of the previous one, 40 minutes was still far too restrictive to tell a truly dramatic story. Initially, Hosoda had the idea of a road trip movie inspired by the Robert De Niro film Midnight Run, wherein Taichi would meet and interact with a new character throughout the film, their relationship initially at odds before eventually bonding and improving. This idea ultimately did not make it very far into production, and what was settled on instead was a simple action thriller, which Hosoda felt would better suit the short runtime. It was decided that the plot would involve the internet as a major factor. While the internet was still relatively in its infancy in the year 2000, it was seeing a rapid uptake in regular users, and more acceptance within the cultural zeitgeist. Given the concept of Digimon as literally residing in a digital realm, this lent itself far too well to this franchise to ignore. Furthermore, with the Y2K scare still fresh in the public's mind, Yoshida and Hosoda thought it would be cool to explore the possibility of, what if Y2K was actually a Digimon's fault? The dominoes were all falling into place to create a product that this franchise was seemingly cater-built to make, at just the right place and time in the cultural sphere to be perfectly relevant. The film would be titled Digimon Adventure Our War Game, alternatively titled Children's War Game, and released right on schedule in March of 2000.
ある日、インターネット上に凶悪なデジモンが現れた。
なんだこいつは。
世界中を混乱させる謎のデジモン。
俺たちが地球を救うんだ。行けグレイモン。友情パワーで究極体にワープ進化だ。
Where the first Digimon short film was a precursor to the anime, this film was a sequel. Premiering as the anime's first season only had 2 or 3 episodes still left to air. The plot takes place during spring break of 2000, 7 months after the events of the anime, and much like episode 21, the same period of time in which the movie was released. The film begins with Koshiro discovering a digi-egg on the internet that soon hatches into a Digimon with virus-like tendencies, acting only on the instinct to consume as much data as possible and become as powerful and widespread as it can. Koshiro immediately alerts Taichi to the situation, and the two come into contact with Genai, who is already prepared to transfer their Digimon from the digital world into the internet itself to combat the threat. Taichi tries to get into contact with the other members of their group so they can offer their aid, but he finds most of it in vain as they're all busy with their day-to-day lives during spring break, vacation, entrance exams, you know the deal. And thus, the pair can't get in touch with anybody over the phone. This was pre-cell phone era, after all. He does manage to get in touch with Yamato and Takeru visiting their grandmother in Shimane, who are willing to help, but have trouble finding a web-capable computer in the old-fashioned Japanese town. Meanwhile, the online Digimon has evolved several stages in a matter of hours, while Agumon and Tentomon try in vain to fend it off. While Gabumon and Patamon are eventually able to come to their aid, Patamon and Tentomon are quickly taken out of the fight once the virus Digimon reaches its final evolved form. And all the while, the group is facing repeated computer crashes and connection issues, especially once the virus Digimon, Diablomon, gets wise and starts overwhelming phone lines. Eventually, the worst-case scenario plays out as Diablomon manages to find its way into the Pentagon's computer system, launching a nuclear missile straight at Tokyo to try to take out the kids at their source. In addition to this, Diablomon splits himself into thousands of copies, sending the kids a taunting email to find and destroy the one copy holding the detonation timer before its countdown reaches 0. All hope soon seems lost as the clones effortlessly overwhelm War Greymon and Metal Garurumon, but the bond with their human partners, as well as support from children all over the world watching the event play out in real time through their own computers, creates the final miracle needed to save the day. The film succeeded in its goal of a simple yet thrilling narrative, with stakes almost unbelievably high for a kid's toy franchise. This was serious stuff. That's not to say the film was all doom and gloom, as there were several jokes and gags to provide a healthy amount of levity to the script, but almost all of these are confined to the story's first 2 acts, and die down considerably once the nukes come into play. Given the film's title, the plot no doubt took some inspiration from the 1983 Matthew Broderick film War Games, which is about a high school computer geek being unexpectedly conscripted by the US government into using his hacking skills to stop a threat of nuclear warfare. Despite this inspiration, our war game is a product all its own, and fans absolutely love it. Honestly, several non-Digimon fans love it too. Our war game is seen as something of a creative peak for the franchise, being the perfect right place, right time story in subject matter with just enough drama to keep it compelling. The lasting impact of our war game on the Digimon franchise cannot be overstated. It received a direct sequel, albeit without Hosoda's involvement, in 2001 in the form of the fourth Digimon film, Diablemon Strikes Back. Its aesthetic, setting, and characters would make appearances in future Digimon video games, the most clear example being the setting and aesthetic of the virtual world in the 2014 video game Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth. The 20th anniversary film, Last Evolution Kizuna, would pay homage to the plot of our war game in its first act, and the 2020 TV reboot of the first season would repurpose the plot of our war game into its first 3 episodes. Biggest of all, the film saw the debut of Omegamon, known as Omnimon in the English dub, the miraculous fusion of War Greymon and Metal Garurumon. This process of combining 2 Digimon into a stronger, higher form is known as Jogress, a portmanteau of joint progress. And while it had been a mechanic in the VPETs, cards, and video games since 1998, this was the first time we were seeing it in the anime. Furthermore, Omegamon was a unique case. Jogress evolution was initially established as simply being an alternate evolution method, wherein 2 Digimon, unable to reach their next evolutions on their own, would combine their energies in order to force the process. The resulting Digimon was not a literal combination of its component monsters, rather, Jogress was simply a shortcut to reach a stage that would have otherwise been naturally occurring. Omegamon was different in that it was clearly designed to be specifically a fusion of War Greymon and Metal Garurumon, created strictly through the fusion of those 2 monsters and not naturally occurring otherwise. And Omegamon's design went through several early iterations, initially being a much more literal combination of wolf and dragon-like features before being redesigned again and again at the behest of Hosoda into a more sleek, more symbolic design that the director was pleased with. The design itself proved to be incredibly appealing, and add to that the dramatic weight and impact of Omegamon's debut scene, and you have a recipe for success. Omegamon would see repeated variants and different forms created over the years, and to this day regularly places number 1 in fan favorite polls. Omegamon would prove to be revolutionary for the franchise, for better and for worse. After this point, we would see a huge spike in sleek, armored humanoid Digimon, presumably as Bandai and Toei tried to rebottle some of that lightning. From that point on, seeing more bestial or abstract Digimon designs, especially as you reach the higher evolved forms, would become more of an exception than the rule. An entire subset of Digimon known as the Royal Knights would also be created, essentially a group of in-universe Omegamon-inspired designs Bandai hoped would become popular simply through association. And for the most part, it kinda worked. Mostly because for about a 10-year span, Bandai and Toei would trot out the Royal Knights as a major plot point in basically any Digimon anime or video game that saw release between 2002 and 2014. And with that much repeated exposure, they were bound to find some form of popularity. But our war game didn't just have a lasting impact on Digimon, but on Hosoda as well. Clearly something about the film's concept and aesthetic resonated with the director, as he would return to it a handful of times in the future. First with his 2003 ad created for Louis Vuitton, and of course his 2009 full-length feature, Summer Wars. But we'll get to those later. Our war game was so massively popular that its effect is still felt on the franchise over 20 years later, and it's still regularly looked back on as arguably being the franchise's crowning achievement. So let's talk about the American version. Digimon Adventure's English dub, simply titled Digimon Digital Monsters, was produced by Saban Entertainment and aired on the Fox Kids Saturday morning block, the same studio and network responsible for Spider-Man the Animated Series and the American version of Power Rangers. The English dub began airing in August 1999, a scant 5 months behind the Japanese. While this sounds like an eternity in today's era of anime streaming, fan subs, and simul-dubbing, at the time this was an incredibly quick turnaround for an anime dub. anime was still a niche market at the time. And with most American media still a bit hesitant to even acknowledge that Japanese media existed, this meant that Japanese shows typically spent years in limbo before licensing and localization would even be considered. But with the instant phenomenon of Pokemon having recently taken off in the States, rival cartoon studios were scrambling to create or license anything that could compete. And on the surface at least, Digimon seemed like one of those properties. No doubt, Saban was able to secure licensing rights to Digimon fairly easily due to their history localizing other Toei franchises like Super Sentai and Kamen Rider. And Saban and the American branch of Bandai poured a lot of marketing into the show. While the first generation of Digimon Virtual Pets had seen a stateside release in the midst of the 90s Tamagotchi craze, they weren't really a runaway success by any stretch. And no other aspect of early Digimon would see a localization until the first season of the anime. For all intents and purposes, Digimon, to the average American eye, seemed like a quick, shallow cash grab TV show looking to leech off of Pokemon's success, a misconception that the franchise still has trouble shaking to this very day. The gap between Japanese and American air dates for episodes of Digimon were as short as 5 to 2 months, so understandably the English dub could sometimes come off as a bit of a rush job. Many scripts felt like first drafts.
My name's Koromon, and we're partners! Koromon? That means talking head? It means brave little warrior, and don't forget it, Ty!
Sound editing was incredibly choppy, with volume levels inconsistent, and sometimes random lines of dialogue just being overlaid over the audio for some reason.
Over here!
Matt! Huh? Well, so much for no fighting.
In terms of faithfulness to the Japanese, though, it was fine. It fell into a lot of the pitfalls of 90s kids anime dubs with joke-heavy dialogue and a lightened tone, but significant changes to the actual plot were almost non-existent, which was actually quite rare for English dub localizations. Next to comparable anime dubs of the time, such as Pokemon, Robotech, Dragon Ball Z, Sailor Moon, and Cardcaptors, Digimon stood out as being the only one to not have significantly rewritten its plot or have any banned or lost episodes. And instances of censorship were rarer and fairly more mild than was expected.
何して遊ぼっかな。これがね、44マグナム、破壊力あるんだよ。それからこれはダムダム弾。これを打ち込むとね、お腹の中が破裂するんだ。
In addition, it was probably the only children's anime dub that didn't try to hide that it was, in fact, from Japan. No rice balls being changed into donuts or burgers, and they didn't try to pretend that Tokyo was like Chicago or something.
Calm down. I do know the location of the child. It's Japan.
Huh? Japan?
Huh?
Where is Japan? Japan's a big island in the Far East.
Agumon and Tai were transported there when our two worlds converged.
So, in short, while it's definitely a product of its time, the Digimon dub at least made efforts to preserve the spirit of the original show.
なんだよ、そんな逃げ腰じゃ拉致が開かないだろう。
お前の無鉄砲に付き合わせてみんなを危険にさらすつもりかよ。
なんだと。
Come on, Matt. Don't be a wimp. We won't get anywhere if we just stand around talking.
Put your fist down when you talk to me and stop acting like you can just bully your way into being the leader.
What are you saying?
And in the end, Digimon would prove to be one of the block's most successful programs, with it and Power Rangers dominating the ratings for kids programming on the network. In terms of so-called Pokemon clones that existed at the time, Digimon was far and away the closest to being its equal in terms of popularity. And so when Pokemon launched its first theatrical film in the US in late 1999, you can bet that Fox was looking to get a slice of that Warner Bros. Pie. Unfortunately for Fox, Digimon didn't have any feature-length films like Pokemon. It did, however, have 3 short films, including the 2 Hosoda films we've already discussed. Saban and Fox signed a deal with Toei to dub and screen these short films in the US. Jeff Nimoy, along with co-writer Bob Buchholz, acted as head writers and producers for the English dub's first 2 seasons, and Nimoy came up with a screenplay for the film that combined the 2 Hosoda short films into an 80-minute runtime, making them officially feature-length and fit for American theaters. Now, it's worth noting that those first two films combined only add up to an hour, and while Nimoy has never clarified what the additional 20 minutes consisted of, we can speculate. I personally theorize that a 20-minute clip show or a recap of the first season was placed in between the two films to get audiences, and perhaps more importantly, parents, up to speed on the events that took place between the two shorts. Nimoy has said how proud he was of that initial script, but ultimately, this is not the script the studio would go with, and that's almost entirely due to the aforementioned third film. And this is where things get complicated. The third Digimon short film, which has a super long title that I will not be reading aloud, so here it is on screen, premiered in Japan in July 2000. The film itself was presented as a double feature, with two 30-minute segments and an intermission. Hence the super long title. It's actually two titles. While this film was written by a returning Reiko Yoshida, it was not directed by Mamoru Hosoda, but rather Shigeyasu Yamauchi. So, the initial plan for the English dub was to combine the first two movies into a single work that would be screened theatrically, and then dub and air the third as a TV special. However, part of the deal with Toei obligated Saban and Fox to screen all three films theatrically, and this brought with it several complications. The first issue was simply one of runtime. Ideally, movies for kids try not to run longer than 80 or 90 minutes, considered something of a sweet spot for children's often shorter attention spans. But the first three Digimon films altogether added up to almost exactly 2 full hours. Even if the dubbing staff were willing to combine all three films, the studio was absolutely not willing to budge on meeting that 80 to 90 minute runtime. Cuts were definitely going to have to be made, and to a rather significant degree. The second issue was one of structure. The third film was set within the show's second season, titled Digimon Adventure 02. The second season of the show was a direct sequel to the first, but focused on an almost entirely new cast of characters, as the original characters had grown older and adopted more responsibilities in their personal lives. This meant that the final portion of the combined movie would focus on an entirely different cast than the first two acts, going against every rule of screenwriting. In addition, while the first two movies can easily be combined and still be tonally consistent due to having the same writer and director, not only is the third movie's plot entirely unrelated, but the entire atmosphere is drastically different. While the first two films were brisk and fairly frenetic action stories, the third film is almost lethargic, introspective, ethereal. Fans often describe it as feeling like a fever dream. So not only would significant chops need to be made to combine the three films into a single 80-minute work, the story would also clearly need to be reworked and rewritten to tie all three into a single, cohesive, tonally consistent narrative. So in other words, it would become exactly the type of anime dub the Digimon TV series had avoided becoming. It was a mess. 2 films were too short, all 3 films together were too long, but all 3 films absolutely had to see theatrical release due to the terms of the agreement with Toei. So what did we end up getting? Well, to paraphrase Encyclopedia Dramatica, 2 short films aired back-to-back with an incoherent 20-minute non-sequitur tacked on the end. Yes, roughly half of the third film's runtime had to be cut. This was accomplished by cutting a B-plot involving the abduction of the first season's cast members. Given that the third film had the longest screen time of the 3, as well as just being generally slower and less eventful than the first 2, it made sense that the third film was where the bulk of the edits occurred. In addition, the third film's antagonist had their backstory and motivation entirely rewritten in order to tie the third film into the narrative of the second.
8 years ago, a Digi-Egg came out of my computer, and it hatched into twin Digimon, Terriermon and Cocomon. I finally had someone to play with, my very own pets, and they talked too. It was the best. They depended on me. You have to give it time to heal, okay? Sometimes they would even do my chores for me. I thought it would be cool to have more of them, so I got the stupid idea of creating a Digi-Egg on the computer. That's when it all went bad. Before my Digi-Egg could hatch, it was attacked by a virus, and it mutated into Diaboromon. When Tai and the others destroyed him, I thought my bad dream was finally over, but the real nightmare was just beginning. The virus somehow tracked us down and dragged Kokomon away from me. I watched helplessly for 4 years as he slowly became this terrible monster. And now he's obsessed with chasing me.
Despite adding narration over the 3 movies in an attempt to tie them all together at least somewhat cohesively, it was obvious to anyone who knew how anime dubbing worked that this was clearly just 3 movies combined. The studio did the best they could given the circumstances, but the final result was doomed to be a mess, which was a shame coming from a dub that was known for being fairly faithful to its source material. The changes made to the American version of the film were so drastic, in fact, that the Voice Actors Guild actually didn't consider it a dub at all. Voice acting jobs for dubs pay far less than those for original animation, and so when the film was submitted to the Voice Actors Guild to determine the actors' rates, the guild declared that the degree of cuts and rewrites made to the film classified it as a new work, and not a dub at all, meaning the studio had to pay the actors higher rates. That's a bit of a tangent, but that's like my favorite piece of trivia about this movie. Anyway, despite all this, the movie's $5 million budget meant that production values were a step up from the English dub of the show. No weird editing goofs or odd sound mixing, production values are generally higher. The film also featured a boatload of licensed music, mainly pop and ska bands from the late 90s, and this movie did all-star before Shrek did. Somebody! The film was also incredibly joke-heavy, even by the standards of the English dub, and even in the notoriously gloomy third act.
He asks where that weird-looking head came from, let's tell him our chicken coop is on a nuclear waste dump. Is he sick? You gave him your liver sticks, didn't you?
Did you see that?
No, I was sleeping.
But you're driving!
I'd hate to see the chicken that egg came out of.
Okay, that's 1 box of chocolates. Your total comes to 1,100,000. Huh? Yeah, that's what it says. That must be really good chocolate. Paper or plastic?
Huh? Agumon, where are you? I can barely hear you. Take me off speakerphone.
All circuits are still busy.
Don't tell me.
Didn't you hear me?
What?
It's busy!
I'm sorry, lady.
War Greymon, quit like a coward.
Ow! You take that back, or I'll...
I was reading an email from another kid.
You didn't have to read it so well.
You got mail!
What's the matter with you?
That's the saddest story I ever heard.
I'm the one with the problem, not you. Get over it.
Okay.
The film would gross over $14 million at the box office. Not exactly Pokemon the first movie numbers, which made over $100 million on the exact same budget, but it was impressive nonetheless, and believe it or not, the success of this chopped-up American chimera of films would have positive effects on Mamoru Hosoda's career back in Japan. Around the same time he was working on Our War Game, Hosoda also directed a 7-minute CG animation called Digimon Adventure 3D, Digimon Grand Prix. The short was created for the purpose of an attraction at a Toei-sponsored Hello Kitty theme park, and was aired at the park from July 2000 to June 2002. The short itself is an homage to Wacky Races, a classic American TV cartoon, using Digimon characters from the show's first 2 seasons, and largely consisting of slapstick-style hijinks and gags as the characters race in their own unique cars and vehicles. The soundtrack is recycled almost entirely from that of Our War Game. The short was narrated throughout, in the style of a live sports commentary, by announcer Fukui from Fuji TV, the same television station that co-produced and aired the Digimon anime. The short itself is pretty unremarkable, and being created for the purpose of a theme park attraction is essentially just fluff. Not long after his work on Our War Game, Hosoda was approached by a producer from Studio Ghibli, Toshio Suzuki, and offered a job directing their then upcoming film Howl's Moving Castle. Originally planned for a summer 2003 release, production on the film quickly led to creative differences. In interviews since, Hosoda has explained, quote, "I was told to make the movie similar to how Miyazaki would have made it, but I wanted to make my own film the way I wanted to make it." Hosoda would ultimately leave the project and Studio Ghibli in the summer of 2002, with the film still in early production at the time, and directorial duties on Howl's Moving Castle would then rest on Miyazaki himself. After departing from Ghibli, Hosoda would briefly return to Toei Animation, where he would helm a handful of projects. The first was an animated Louis Vuitton advertisement/short film entitled Superflat Monogram, which was inspired by and borrowed aesthetics from our wargame. And the second was as the director of a One Piece film, Baron Omatsuri and the Secret Island, which was the 6th One Piece film overall. Hosoda would also be commissioned to direct the opening sequence of Samurai Champloo, a project that would introduce him to producer Yuichiro Saito, who would become a regular collaborator with Hosoda in the future. Hosoda would also direct a single episode of Magical Do-Re-Mi, which led to Hosoda being discovered and hired by Studio Madhouse in 2005. This event would ultimately kickstart the next major leg of Hosoda's career. Madhouse would immediately task Hosoda with feature film projects, trusting in his talent that he would be able to deliver quality work. The first of these was 2006's The Girl Who Leapt Through Time, a nebulous half-adaptation, half-sequel to the Japanese 1967 novel of the same name. The film would go on to be nominated for 10 film awards, and would win 9 of them, including 3 awards for Best Animated Film across 2 countries, Japan and Spain. The second of Hosoda's Madhouse projects was 2009's Summer Wars, an original work conceived by Hosoda himself that would go on to win the same Japanese Best Animated Film award as Hosoda's previous film. The plot of the film bears more than a few striking similarities to our wargame, to the point that Hosoda's Digimon film could be considered a sort of prototype for Summer Wars. While the film holds a stronger thematic center based around the value of family and community, a luxury afforded by the film's feature-length runtime when compared to our wargame, the beat-for-beat plot points are remarkably similar, with everything from a sentient computer virus triggering nuclear missiles to worldwide emails triggering a transformation in the main character that ends up saving the day. The aesthetic of Summer Wars' online world in this film known as Oz is clearly along the same lines as the internet from our wargame, and some specific scenes are almost shot-for-shot recreations. Still, the film is very different from the prior Digimon film in terms of characterization and theming, no doubt thanks to being an original work that would not be held back by being associated with a pre-existing franchise. While the plot can essentially be summed up as our wargame but without the Digimon, doing so does the film a great disservice. It does stand on its own as a unique work of art, and is ultimately a much stronger final product, at the end of the day, than our wargame was. After the success of his first 2 full-length film projects, Mamoru Hosoda would depart Studio Madhouse in 2011 and co-found his own studio, Studio Chizu, with producer Yuichiro Saito, who was producer on Girl Who Leapt Through Time. Chizu has so far released 4 films directed by Hosoda: 2012's Wolf Children, 2015's The Boy and the Beast, 2018's Need I, and 2021's Belle, all of which received critical acclaim, with Mirai in particular being nominated for Best Animated Feature at the Oscars. Yes, those Oscars.
Oh, wow!
Ultimately, I believe it's safe to say that Hosoda is one of the most talented and easily recognizable directors working in animation today. His style is distinct but subtle, his attention to detail second to none, and his passion clearly felt in every project he works on, even those others would see as shallow franchise work. If there is any debate for who is to take the title of the next Miyazaki, my vote is clearly cast for him. And his high-quality contributions to the Digimon franchise make me all the more proud to be a Digimon fan.